So we are here from PunchCon with Scott Moore, the designer of This War Without an Enemy. But we're here for demoing some games from Nuts. And we're going to be demoing Port Arthur, which should be the next in the Combat Ration system. So we have, that was 300, the first one, and right, the next one is Port Arthur, so on the Russo-Japanese War. So I'll let you maybe give us a bit of an introduction of what the game is about and how it plays.
Okay, so this game was originally published by Bonsai Games as Red Sun Blue Cross. We've changed the name to Port Arthur, which is a more recognisable name in the Russo-Japanese War. So the game covers the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. The game focuses on the naval aspects of the war. The land campaign is abstracted very much. The game takes place over 6 turns. We have the turn track here. We have the Russian player in blue, Japanese player in red. During setup, we have the Japanese fleets in Japan. The Russian fleet is split between Port Arthur and Vladivostok. And on turns 4 and 5, the Baltic fleet arrives in the East China Sea. The components, the ships, so the ships have a speed, which is shown by the die. Speed can vary from 3 to 6. And they have a strength factor, which is a number between 1 and 6.
All of the counters have specific ships written on it.
Exactly.
So it is quite different from 300, for example, where everything was abstracted. Here, it looks a lot more detailed, right?
Yeah. So the way a turn works is, first of all, we have if it's turn 4 or turn 5, we have the arrival of the Russian Baltic fleet in the East China Sea. Then we have the sortie phase, beginning with the Japanese player. So the Japanese player can move any or all of their ships out into the sea. The player will form the ships out into fleets composed of any number of ships. And each fleet during the sortie can move into an adjacent area, and then, provided the ships are not damaged, they can move one further area. So, for example, they could move into the East China Sea, and then from there into the Yellow Sea. Other ships can form another fleet. Like so. If the player has any damaged ships, so from turn 2 onwards, it's possible to have damaged ships. Damaged ships are shown on the reverse side. They can be placed for repair, and they spend the whole turn being repaired. After the Japanese player has done their sorties, then the Russian player does the same. The Russian player again forms the ships into fleets, and these can move 1 or 2 areas, provided they're not damaged. If any ship in the fleet is damaged, then the fleet can only move 1 area, to an area adjacent to the port. There's no restriction on movement during the sorties. It doesn't matter if there's a Japanese fleet that's already sortied, it can move past them.
Yeah, because those are really large sea areas.
Exactly, yeah. So that's the sortie phase, fairly simple. Then we go on to the operations phase. During the operations phase, each player will roll a d6, and whoever rolls a higher die has the initiative, and they will take 1 activation. After their activation, both players roll the dice again, and whoever rolls the highest will take the next activation. So it's possible for a player to have multiple activations in a row. If both players roll the same number, then it's the end of the turn.
Okay.
And we go on to the next turn.
Yeah.
The exception is one player, starting with the Japanese player, will start with the initiative token. That can be spent in order to prevent the turn from ending. So if the Japanese player wants the turn to last longer, they could spend the token and give it to the other player. If you've won the initiative, what can you do? You can move a fleet to an adjacent area. So when you activate a fleet, you have to roll equal to or less than the number of the slowest ship.
Okay.
So if we have a fleet comprised only of ships speed 5, as long as you roll a 1 to 5, you can activate.
Yeah.
If you roll a 6, you lose the activation, and the other player can then activate.
Okay.
A fleet comprises all of the ships in an area. If they move into an adjacent area, then they'll combine with any of your ships already there to form a new fleet. Once you've formed the fleet, you cannot split it up. For example, the Russian player wins initiative again. The Russian player has an option to move a fleet, or another option on your turn is to initiate a naval battle. You can only initiate a battle in a sea area where you have an opposing fleet. If you want to initiate a naval battle, you have to activate the fleets. This Russian fleet here has a speed of 5, so the Russian player would roll a d6, provided they roll 1 to 5, the battle's initiated. And in the battle, we determine who's player 1, who's player 2. The player with the fastest fleet is player 1. In this case, the Russian fleet is speed 5, the Japanese fleet is speed 4. The Russian fleet is quicker, so the Russian player would be player 1 in the battle, and they would roll their dice first. If there's a tie, if both fleets are of equal speed, then it's the defender who will go first in the battle. If you're not player 1 in the battle and you have the initiative token, you can spend the initiative token, pass it to the other player, and you will become player 1. A battle is 1 round only. After the end of that round of battle, then we go back to the initiative, and either player on there, if they win the initiative, they can launch another round of battle, or they can do other actions with their fleets. So let's say the Russian player is player 1. First of all, we look at the total strength of the fleets. Here it's 1 plus 4 plus 5 is 10. And now the Russian player must choose a number of dice to roll.
Hey, Editing Fred here, back once again in the middle of the video. The reason why I'm here is just to say that, unfortunately, while recording the demo of Port Arthur, I lost a tiny bit of footage when Scott is talking about how the dice results works. I think you'll figure it out watching the rest of the video. It's just a tiny bit of rules, but that's fine. You still get a sense for how the game functions. I hope that you'll enjoy the video anyway, and please remember to like, subscribe, comment, and all that to support the channel. So thanks, and see you soon.
So a critical hit can either flip over an enemy ship counter to its damage side, like so, or if a ship is already damaged, it can eliminate it, and then it's removed from the game. So for example, with a critical hit, the Russian player might choose the strongest enemy ship and reduce this to its damage side. Then we apply the 3 critical hits. These are applied by the player receiving the hits. So here the Japanese player would apply these 3 hits. 1 hit will flip a full strength ship counter. So here there are 3 hits. You must apply all of the hits. If there were additional hits here, then you could apply hits to already damaged counters, and each counter has a number of hits which must be applied to eliminate it. So in the case of this, once damaged, if it takes 1 additional hit, it's eliminated. With a stronger ship counter here, it needs to take 4 hits to be eliminated. The player distributing the hits must distribute all of them if possible. So in some cases, you may need to eliminate more ships than you'd like to in order to take all of the damage. Then player 2 will do the same, roll the dice. In this case, player 2 now has a strength of 13. Player 2 might decide to roll, let's say, all 6 dice. So here the result is very high, 1824. If the sum of the dice is greater than the strength of the fleet, then there'll be no critical hits, and the number of normal hits will be less. What we do is we take the dice, starting with the highest, and we keep adding dice as long as the sum is less than the strength of the fleet. So the strength of the fleet here is 13. Take 2 dice, we're up to 12. We cannot take this third 6 because then it would be greater than the... So in this case, we only we only cause 2 hits on the Russian fleet, and they're not critical hits, they're normal hits, so the Russian player will choose which ships take those hits. It will be the weakest 2. So the combat system is, in a way, it's a little bit push your luck, or it's a gamble. The more dice you choose, the more hits you could, in theory, impose, but the more chance of exceeding the strength of your fleet and causing much fewer hits.
Is there any limit on the fleet size?
There's no limit on the fleet size.
Okay.
The ships remain after a battle, and either player, if there are enemy ships remaining, can, on their activation, initiate a new round of battle, or they can move their ships away. The third type of action is to move your ships into port. So you can move one fleet back into port. A turn will continue until, on the initiative dice, both players roll the same number, and whoever has the initiative token, if they
Decides to keep it.
decide not to pay it. One thing I forgot at the very beginning of the turn, the Japanese player can decide whether or not they want to land troops. So there are 2 positions marked here where they can place army cubes. At the end of a turn, we're going to do scoring, and we're going to look at the progress of the land war. At the end of the turn, if the Japanese player controls this sea here, then their land unit can progress to the next space. The player only has control of the sea area if only they have a fleet in that area. So if there was a Russian fleet here, the Japanese player would not have control, and they would lose their army counter, and this would be a point for the Russian player. If the Japanese player controls the sea, then their army counter advances. In the case of this sea here, if this were the situation, they would lose this army marker, and it would be a point for the Russians. If there are no Russian ships, no Russian fleet here, they could advance their counter, their cube, to the next space on this track here. Now this is important for the Japanese player, because the Japanese player cannot win the game unless they have placed a cube in Mukden. So for this they will need to have a minimum of 4 cubes on the map. At this position here, when they place the next cube, they can either go for Mukden or they can go for 203 Hill. As soon as the Japanese player places a cube here, it destroys the shipyards in Port Arthur, and from then on, Russian ships cannot be repaired here. If a cube is placed in this position here, this represents the Japanese army capturing Port Arthur. Any Russian ships here are eliminated, and it no longer functions as a port.
And how do the Japanese score points?
The Japanese can score points if they place a cube in Sipping. If they place a cube here, they roll a die. If they roll a 3 or less, they gain 1 point. A 4 or 6 is no effect. And they roll for this at the end of every turn.
Okay.
You notice there are only 6 cubes, but there's 7 positions, so the Japanese player will need to decide whether to go for shipping or whether to go for the capture of Port Arthur. The other way to gain points is control of all the sea areas. So there are different types of victory point gains. For Sea of Japan here, only the Japanese player can gain victory points. So if the Japanese player controls this sea, they gain 2 victory points. It's the same for the Pacific Ocean. For the Philippine Sea, only the Russian player can gain victory points, 2 victory points if they control it. East China Sea, Tsushima, and the Yellow Sea. For these 3 areas, if you control one of them, you gain 1 victory point. If you control 2, you gain 2 victory points for each one. If you control 3, you gain 3 victory points for each one. And that can be for either player. The victory point track is a relative track here. There are a maximum of 4 victory points towards your side. You cannot gain more than that. At the end of the game, if the marker is towards your side, you've won. And provided that the Japanese have captured Mukden. If they haven't, it doesn't matter where the victory point marker is, the Russian player has won. If it's a draw, then I need to check the rules for that.
Yeah, it's fine.